Right, in this next piece, we're working with solving inverse trig equations again, but for this situation, we're saying, hey, explain why it is not possible to solve the following equation as written. But then, to write and solve a more appropriate equation. Okay, so here's what we've got. We know that the output of my inverse sine, excuse me, I miswrote that a little bit. We're okay here. Right? We know that the output of my inverse sine is between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. Well, if I start this solution process, I have that the inverse sine of x is equal to 2 pi over 3. Well, immediately here, this is a range error. That technically speaking, the output of the inverse sine cannot be 2 pi over 3. No, can't do it. That's the problem with this equation. However, we can think of still undoing the inverse sine and kind of what this represents. Right? What this represents is that I could think about this as saying, hey, that x has to be the sine of 2 pi over 3. And that's an okay equation to solve. That x needs to be the sine of 2 pi over 3. Right? That I'm saying, hey, I have some ratio of 2 pi over 3, right? And so if I undo the inverse sine with the sine, I have x equals the sine of 2 pi over 3. That's okay. But it's extremely important to understand that this right here, as written, is not valid. We have a range error. That the outputs of the inverse sine are between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. Right? But if I was going to say, okay, what's kind of the feeling, what's the implication to this? Well, x is the sine of 2 pi over 3. Right? From our knowledge of our unit circle or our reference, we know that that answer is root 3 over 2. Okay? In a similar fashion, we can look at this equation here. Right? And we come over here, we can kind of start this out and say, hey, I'm going to have here the inverse cosine of this angle x minus 1 is equal to 3 pi over 2. Right? However, recall that the inverse cosine is restricted to be between 0 and pi. Is 3 pi over 2 between 0 and pi? No. No, it is not. So here, I have a range error. And due to this range error, this is an invalid equation, right? The inverse cosine can never be 3 pi over 2. However, I can think of the general idea of what this equation is representing, and the general idea of what this equation is representing is to be able to say, hey, let me take the cosine of both sides of this to undo the inverse cosine, and that would tell me that x minus 1 is going to be equal to the cosine of 3 pi over 2, and that equation is okay to solve. And from here I could say that x minus 1 is equal to 0, and therefore x is equal to 1. Okay? So do be aware that there are some equations that you can get an answer for if you kind of just think through the math, but which initially are actually incorrectly written equations. It is important for you to be familiar with the range. It's also important for you to be familiar with the domain. Okay? Work through these problems, practice, ask questions for clarification. Right? The better you practice, the better you get.